September 14th, 1888. The mud-caked banks of the River Feel, 3 miles south of Listowel, County Kerry, Ireland. A farmer's dog returns from its morning hunt carrying something that isn't a rabbit. The object clutched in its jaws is leathered, partially decomposed but unmistakably human. A severed hand, still wearing a gold signet ring engraved with the initials PM. Patrick Moriarty had been missing for 6 weeks. When constables searched the riverbank, they discovered something far more disturbing than a body. Hidden beneath the roots of a willow tree, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a collection of personal effects that didn't belong to the dead man. Pocket watches, cufflinks, a silver cigarette case, and most chillingly, a dried hare's foot on a golden chain, still crusted with what would later be identified as human blood. Each item had been reported missing. Each belonged to a different bookmaker who had vanished over the past 18 months. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple murderer collecting trophies. Before we uncover the truth about Ireland's most superstitious serial killer, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back into the gambling halls and racing grounds of 1880s Ireland, where luck was currency, and some men would do anything to change their fortune. The Ireland of 1888 existed in a state of profound tension. The land war still smoldered across the countryside, pitting tenant farmers against Anglo-Irish landlords in a bitter struggle that had claimed lives and livelihoods. The Irish National League organized rent strikes and boycotts. Agrarian violence erupted sporadically, unpredictably. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, people clung to whatever certainties they could find. For the working classes of County Kerry, those certainties often came in the form of superstition. Listowel, a market town of approximately 3,500 souls, sat at the confluence of ancient tradition and modern commerce. The town had hosted horse races since 1858, and by the 1880s, the Listowel Races had become one of Ireland's premier sporting events. Every September, the population would swell to nearly 10,000 as racing enthusiasts, gamblers, and opportunists descended upon the town. Hotels overflowed, public houses operated around the clock, and fortunes changed hands with dizzying speed. The bookmakers who worked the races occupied a peculiar social position. They were neither respectable businessmen nor common laborers. They existed in the gray spaces of society, tolerated, utilized, but never quite trusted. These men handled more money in a week than most farmers saw in a year, yet they possessed no permanent establishments, no fixed addresses. They moved from race to race, carrying their wealth in leather satchels, their reputations preceding them like shadows. Thomas Galvin was one such man. 42 years old in 1888, Galvin had worked as a bookmaker for nearly 20 years. He was known for his mathematical precision, his steel-trap memory, and his uncanny ability to predict outcomes. While other bookmakers went bankrupt or fled town ahead of debts, Galvin prospered. His clothes were fine without being ostentatious. His lodgings, when he took them, were comfortable. He never drank to excess, never gambled himself, and never extended credit to desperate men. Those who knew him described a man of rigid habits and peculiar obsessions. He ate the same breakfast every morning, 2 eggs, black pudding, brown bread. He wore the same style of suit year after year, only replacing garments when they wore through. And he possessed an extensive collection of what he called his luck pieces, objects he believed carried supernatural power to influence probability itself. A rabbit's foot hung from his watch chain. A horseshoe nail resided in his left shoe. He kept a dried crow's claw in his breast pocket and would touch it before accepting any substantial wager. His competitors found these habits amusing. The racing crowd considered them part of his character, like a performer's costume. No one thought to question where a man who never lost might have acquired such powerful charms. No one, that is, until other bookmakers began to disappear. The first disappearance occurred in March of 1887. Dermot Flynn, a bookmaker from Cork, failed to appear at the spring meeting in Tralee. This alone wasn't particularly suspicious. Bookmakers occasionally absconded when debts grew too heavy, or when they'd accepted wagers they couldn't cover. But Flynn had been enjoying a profitable season. His ledgers were in order. His lodgings in Cork had been paid through the end of the month. When his landlady entered his rooms 3 weeks after he'd missed his rent payment, she found his belongings untouched. His clothes hung in the wardrobe, His shaving kit sat beside the wash basin. His spare boots waited by the door. The only items missing were the clothes he'd presumably worn when he left, his money satchel, and a distinctive pocket watch, a gold repeater with a hunting scene engraved on the case. The court constabulary investigated perfunctorily. A bachelor bookmaker with no family to press the matter wasn't a priority. The prevailing theory held that Flynn had gotten himself killed in a dispute over gambling debts, and that his body had been dumped in Cork Harbor. The matter was noted, filed, and forgotten. 2 months later, at the County Races in May, a similar disappearance occurred. Seamus O'Donnell, age 36, had established himself as one of Kerry's more successful bookmakers. Unlike the solitary Flynn, O'Donnell was a family man with a wife and 3 children in Killarney. He'd promised his wife he'd be home by Sunday evening after the Saturday races concluded. He never arrived. His wife, Margaret O'Donnell, reported him missing immediately. The constabulary took this case more seriously. Witnesses placed O'Donnell at the races on Saturday, accepting wagers until the final event concluded around 6 in the evening. Several people saw him walking toward his usual lodging house on High Street around 7. He never checked in. His money satchel was never recovered. Neither were several personal effects his wife specifically noted, his silver cigarette case, engraved with their wedding date, and a pair of gold cufflinks that had belonged to his father. The investigation yielded nothing. No body, no witnesses to violence, no clear motive. O'Donnell had no known enemies, no gambling debts, no romantic entanglements. He simply ceased to exist somewhere between the racecourse and his lodgings, swallowed by the warm May evening. Margaret O'Donnell would spend the next year searching for answers, writing letters to constabularies across Munster, offering rewards for information. She received nothing but sympathies and speculation. August 1887 brought the third disappearance, and with it, a pattern began to emerge. Patrick Moriarty operated primarily in County Limerick, but occasionally traveled to the larger Kerry meetings. He'd attended the races in Listowel that August, and by all accounts had enjoyed a profitable week. On the final day of racing, several bookmakers gathered at Linnane's public house to settle accounts and share a meal. Moriarty was among them. Also present was Thomas Galvin. Witnesses would later recall that Moriarty had been in high spirits, perhaps too high. He'd been drinking steadily since the afternoon, celebrating what he claimed was his best week in 5 years. At some point during the evening, fortified by whiskey and success, Moriarty made a comment that silenced the table. "Galvin there never has a bad week, does he? Makes a man wonder about those luck pieces he's always fondling. Where'd you get them, Thomas? From men whose luck ran out?" The comment was delivered as a joke, accompanied by drunken laughter. But several men present remembered the look on Galvin's face, a brief flash of something dark and calculating before his features settled back into their usual placid expression. "Luck finds those who respect it," Galvin replied quietly, "and abandons those who mock it." Moriarty laughed again, called for another round, and the moment passed. He was last seen leaving Linnane's around midnight, walking unsteadily in the direction of his lodgings. The next morning, his landlord found his room empty, the bed unslept in. His satchel was gone. So was his distinctive gold signet ring, the one his wife would later describe to constables, the one engraved with his initials. 3 bookmakers, 3 disappearances, 3 sets of missing personal effects. The constabulary in Listowel, now handling their second disappearance, began to suspect something more organized than random violence. But without bodies, without crime scenes, without any physical evidence of foul play, they had nowhere to direct their investigation. The bookmaking community, however, began to talk. Rumors circulated through the racing circuit. Some bookmakers started traveling in pairs, others hired protection. A few stopped attending the smaller meetings altogether, limiting themselves to the larger, more populated events where safety seemed more assured. Thomas Galvin continued his usual routines, unmolested and apparently unconcerned. He showed up at every race meeting, accepted wagers with his characteristic precision, and won far more often than probability suggested he should. And hanging from his watch chain, catching the light as he calculated odds and counted money, was a dried hare's foot on a thin gold chain. No one could quite remember when he'd started wearing it. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these lost chapters of history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. What would you do if you noticed items belonging to missing people in someone's possession? Would you speak up, or would fear of becoming the next victim keep you silent? Let's discover what happens next, because the darkest revelations are still to come. September 14, 1888 began as an unremarkable Friday in rural County Kerry. Martin Sheehan, a tenant farmer working land 3 miles south of Listowel, rose before dawn as was his habit. His Irish Terrier, a 3-year-old dog named Finn, scratched at the door, eager for his morning patrol of the property boundaries. Sheehan let him out and went about his morning chores, feeding chickens, checking on his 2 dairy cows, surveying the small potato field that supplemented his income. Around 7 o'clock, Finn returned to the farmhouse. In his jaws he carried something that wasn't a rabbit or rat. The object was approximately 6 inches long, darkened by decomposition, partially skeletal. But the gold ring still encircling one of the finger bones caught the morning light with unmistakable gleam. Sheehan's stomach turned. He'd seen enough death in his 46 years to recognize human remains. He secured Finn in the house and immediately rode his cart horse into Listowel to fetch Constable James Brennan. By 9 o'clock, Brennan and 2 additional constables stood on the muddy bank of the river Feel, following the trail that Finn had presumably traveled. The river, swollen by recent rains, moved sluggishly through the countryside. Willow trees lined its banks, their roots exposed by decades of erosion, creating hollows and caves beneath the earth. The dog had found the hand approximately 50 yards from Sheehan's property, near a large willow whose roots formed a cage-like structure above the waterline. Brennan, a veteran of 20 years' service, approached the site with methodical care. The hand had become detached from the rest of the body, likely through decomposition and animal activity. The flesh remaining was leathered, blackened, barely recognizable as human, except for the unmistakable structure of finger bones and palm. The gold signet ring, engraved with the initials PM, provided immediate identification. Patrick Moriarty had been missing for 6 weeks. His wife had provided detailed descriptions of his jewelry to the constabulary. This was his ring. Brennan ordered his men to search the immediate area while he examined the willow's root system. The hollow beneath the tree extended back into the riverbank, creating a natural chamber about 4 feet deep. Inside, Brennan could see what appeared to be disturbed earth, and possibly more remains. Using a stick to probe the dark recess, Brennan's makeshift tool struck something solid, something that rattled with the hollow sound of metal on metal. The constables spent the next hour carefully excavating the hollow. What emerged made Brennan immediately dispatch one of his men to fetch the district inspector from Tralee. The remains were extensive, but incomplete. Partial skeletons of at least 3 individuals, intermingled with enough preserved soft tissue to confirm recent death. The September heat and the river's moisture had accelerated decomposition, while the hollow's shelter had prevented total dispersal by scavengers. But it was the collection of personal effects that transformed this from a murder scene into something far more calculated and disturbing. Wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, someone had created a cache of items that clearly didn't belong with the bodies. The collection included a gold pocket watch with a hunting scene engraved on its case, matching the description of Dermot Flynn's missing watch. A silver cigarette case engraved with a date, May 3, 1881, the wedding anniversary of Seamus and Margaret O'Donnell. 2 pairs of gold cufflinks, 1 set matching the description provided by O'Donnell's widow. 3 additional pocket watches, various styles, a collection of smaller items, tie pins, collar studs, a silver pen, and most bizarrely, a dried hare's foot suspended on a thin gold chain, the fur still intact but stiff with age and something darker. Something that crusted the individual hairs and had dried into the creases of the pad. When the district inspector arrived from Tralee that afternoon, Brennan showed him the collection laid out on a blanket. The inspector, John Mahoney, had been in law enforcement for 30 years. He'd seen agrarian murders, faction fights, domestic violence, and robbery gone wrong. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. "These are trophies," Mahoney said quietly, examining the items without touching them. "Someone's been collecting these, deliberately, carefully." "And the hare's foot, sir?" Brennan asked. Mahoney lifted the charm carefully, holding it up to the afternoon light. The dried blood was unmistakable now. Too much blood to have come from the hare itself. The chain had been cleaned, polished even, but the foot itself had been preserved with its grisly coating intact. "Some kind of superstitious practice," Mahoney muttered. "Blood magic, perhaps. There are old beliefs about absorbing another's luck through their possessions, especially if those possessions are taken after—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The investigation had just become a manhunt for something far darker than a simple murderer. They were looking for someone who believed they could steal luck itself, who had collected the personal effects of his victims as talismans, who had imbued them with power through acts of violence. And somewhere in County Kerry, that person was still walking free, still working the races, still wearing his charms. The discovery on the river field transformed from a local investigation into a matter of national concern within 48 hours. District Inspector Mahoney immediately contacted the Royal Irish Constabulary headquarters in Dublin, requesting assistance from their newly formed detective division. The systematic nature of the murders, the calculated collection of trophies, and the possible connection to the racing circuit suggested a level of sophistication that required specialized investigation. By September 17th, Detective Inspector William Crane arrived in Listowel from Dublin. Crane had made his reputation investigating organized crime in the capital, and he brought with him a methodical approach that would prove crucial. His first action was to compile a comprehensive list of every missing person case in Munster over the past 2 years. The results were chilling. Beyond the 3 confirmed victims whose effects had been recovered, an additional 7 individuals connected to the racing industry had been reported missing during the same period. Not all were bookmakers. 2 were jockeys, 1 was a racing official, 3 were wealthy patrons known to place substantial wagers. All had disappeared near race meetings. All had possessed valuable personal effects that were never recovered. Crane's second action was more controversial. He ordered the arrest and questioning of every bookmaker who had worked the Listowel Races in 1887 and 1888. This wasn't a popular decision. The racing season was at its peak, and the bookmakers represented the economic lifeblood of the events. But Crane was unmoved by economic concerns. "Someone has been hunting these men for at least 18 months, he told the gathered constables. "This isn't random, this isn't opportunistic, this is systematic predation, and the predator operates within the racing community itself." Thomas Galvin was among those brought in for questioning on September 19th. The interview took place in a back room of the Listowel Constabulary Station. Crane conducted it personally, with Constable Brennan present as witness. The transcript of that interrogation, preserved in the Kerry County Archives, reveals a fascinating psychological portrait. Crane began with routine questions: Galvin's movements during the relevant time periods, his relationships with the missing men, his knowledge of their disappearances. Galvin answered calmly, precisely, with the same mathematical certainty he brought to calculating odds. He acknowledged knowing all 3 confirmed victims. They were colleagues, competitors in the same profession. Their disappearances had troubled him. He'd even mentioned to other bookmakers that someone should contact the constabulary about the pattern. "But you never contacted them yourself?" Crane asked. "I'm not a man who involves himself in matters that don't concern me directly," Galvin replied. "The constabulary's job is to investigate. Mine is to calculate probabilities and accept wagers. I trust that competent men handle their own responsibilities." Crane let the arrogance of the statement hang in the air before continuing. "I'd like to ask about your personal effects, Mr. Galvin. You're known for carrying what you call luck pieces. Can you describe them for me?" Galvin's expression didn't change, but Brennan would later swear the man's pupils dilated slightly. "I keep a rabbit's foot on my watch chain," Galvin said carefully. "A horseshoe nail in my left shoe. A crow's claw in my breast pocket. These are common talismans, Detective Inspector. Half the men in Ireland carry something similar." "The rabbit's foot," Crane continued. "How long have you owned it?" "Several years. I don't recall exactly. Can you describe it?" "Brown fur, dried. Mounted on a gold chain." Crane reached into his pocket and withdrew the evidence bag containing the hare's foot recovered from the riverbank cache. He placed it on the table between them. "Is this your rabbit's foot, Mr. Galvin?" The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. Galvin stared at the object, his face a mask of forced neutrality. But his hands, resting on the table, had begun to tremble. "I'd need to examine it more closely," he finally said. "Many such items look similar." "This one has blood on it," Crane said quietly. "Human blood. Fresh enough that our medical examiner believes it was applied within the past year. Care to explain how blood gets on a luck charm, Mr. Galvin?" "That isn't mine," Galvin said quickly. "Too quickly. I told you mine is brown fur. That appears darker. Blood darkens things," Crane observed. "Especially when it's deliberately applied, rubbed into the fur. As if someone believed that blood, particularly the blood of a man whose luck had just run out permanently, might transfer that luck to the person holding the charm, Galvin's face had gone pale. "I want a solicitor." "Of course," Crane agreed. "But first I'd like you to empty your pockets, all of them. And I'd like to examine your watch chain." The room fell silent again. Finally, with movements that seemed to take enormous effort, Galvin reached into his vest pocket and withdrew his watch. The chain attached to it was gold, expensive, clearly well-maintained. It was also empty. No rabbit's foot hung from it. "Where's your luck piece, Mr. Galvin?" Crane asked softly. "The one you've worn for several years? The one that's so important to your superstitions that you touch it before every major wager?" Galvin's hands were shaking openly now. I lost it. Recently. I don't know where." "Lost it? A lucky charm you've carried for years." "That seems remarkably careless for a man of your habits." Brennan watched as something crumbled in Galvin's expression, the careful facade of the successful bookmaker giving way to something desperate and cornered. "I want my solicitor," Galvin repeated. "I won't say another word without representation." But the damage was done. Crane had his thread to pull. Over the next week, Detective Inspector Crane methodically dismantled Thomas Galvin's life. Search warrants were obtained for his lodgings in Listowel and his permanent residence in Tralee. What they discovered painted a picture of obsession and calculation that shocked even experienced investigators. Galvin kept meticulous records, not just of wagers and odds, but of his competitors. Detailed notes on their habits, their routines, their weaknesses. He tracked the movements of dozens of bookmakers across Munster, noting when they traveled alone, which lodging houses they preferred, how much money they typically carried. More disturbing were his notebooks on luck and supernatural belief. Page after page of theories about probability manipulation, about objects carrying spiritual power, about the transfer of fortune from one person to another. He'd copied out passages from ancient grimoires, from folk magic texts, from obscure treatises on sympathetic magic. One passage, underlined heavily, read, "The luck of a man resides in his most treasured possessions. To take these at the moment of death is to claim his fortune as your own." But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A local pawnbroker named Samuel Cohen had been following the news of the investigation with growing unease. On September 25th, he contacted Constable Brennan with information that would seal Galvin's fate. Over the past 18 months, Galvin had been bringing items to Cohen's shop in Tralee, not to pawn them, to have them cleaned, restored, occasionally melted down or modified. Cohen kept records of every transaction, as the law required. The dates aligned perfectly with the disappearances. 3 weeks after Dermot Flynn vanished, Galvin brought in a gold pocket watch to have the engraving removed and the case polished. 2 weeks after Seamus O'Donnell disappeared, Galvin brought in gold cufflinks to have them resized. The list went on: tie pins, collar studs, watch chains, all brought in shortly after a bookmaker vanished, all modified just enough to make them difficult to identify. Cohen had thought nothing of it at the time. Bookmakers frequently acquired second-hand goods, won items and wagers, came into possession of jewelry through various means. It was only when the newspapers published descriptions of the missing men's effects that Cohen began to understand what he'd been helping to conceal. Faced with this evidence, Thomas Galvin's solicitor advised him to cooperate. What emerged in his confession was a portrait of desperate superstition twisted into murderous rationality. Galvin admitted to killing at least 6 bookmakers between March 1887 and August 1888. He claimed he'd started after a particularly bad losing streak in early 1887, left him nearly bankrupt. Desperate and unable to understand how his careful calculations had failed him, he'd become convinced that luck itself was a finite resource that could be captured and controlled. His first victim, Dermot Flynn, had been almost accidental. They'd argued after a race meeting, Galvin's mounting desperation making him unusually volatile. The argument had turned physical. Flynn had struck his head during the struggle and died. Panicked, Galvin had hidden the body in the Riverfield hollow he discovered years earlier while fishing. But before disposing of the corpse, Galvin had taken Flynn's pocket watch, the man's most prized possession, and in the weeks that followed, Galvin's luck had seemed to turn. He began winning again. His calculations seemed sharper, his instincts more reliable. To Galvin's superstitious mind, the connection was undeniable. He'd absorbed Flynn's luck by taking his most treasured possession at the moment of death. The watch had become a talisman, a battery of stolen fortune. The subsequent murders had been calculated, methodical. Galvin would identify a successful bookmaker, study their habits, create opportunities to isolate them. He'd develop techniques, drugging drinks at public houses, luring men with promises of inside information on race outcomes, engineering apparent accidents. After each murder, he would take specific items, things the victim had been known to treasure, objects they'd been seen touching or wearing regularly. These became his luck pieces, which he'd wear or carry until their power seemed to fade, at which point he'd modify them and begin hunting again. The hare's foot found at the crime scene hadn't been Galvin's originally. It had belonged to Patrick Moriarty, who'd worn it openly and often mentioned it had been a gift from his mother. Galvin had taken it the night he'd killed Moriarty and had soaked it in the man's blood as part of a ritual he'd read about in one of his occult texts. The trial of Thomas Galvin began in Dublin in March 1889 and lasted 3 weeks. The Crown prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the physical items linking Galvin to the victims, Samuel Cohen's testimony about the modified jewelry, and most devastatingly, Galvin's own confession and notebooks detailing his twisted beliefs. The defense attempted to argue insanity, claiming that Galvin's supernatural beliefs demonstrated a mind detached from reality. But the prosecution countered effectively that the meticulous planning, the careful covering of tracks, and the strategic selection of victims all demonstrated rational thought in service of irrational beliefs. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 6 counts of murder. Thomas Galvin was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place at Mountjoy Prison on May 7, 1889, before a crowd of nearly 200 spectators. His last words, recorded by the prison chaplain, were chillingly consistent with his beliefs. "You're taking away my body, but you can't touch my luck. I've hidden it where no one will ever find it." Investigators searched his properties again, but never found any additional cache of stolen items. Whatever Galvin meant by those final words remains a mystery to this day. The Listowel Races murders sent shockwaves through Irish society that extended far beyond the racing community. The case raised uncomfortable questions about superstition, economic desperation, and the dark places where rational calculation and magical thinking intersect. In the immediate aftermath, the bookmaking profession underwent significant changes. The Irish Turf Club, which governed racing across Ireland, implemented new regulations requiring bookmakers to be licensed and bonded. They established a registry system that tracked bookmaker movements from meeting to meeting, creating a paper trail that would make future disappearances more difficult to conceal. Racing venues began requiring bookmakers to work in designated areas with increased police presence. The informal, anonymous nature of the profession, which had made Galvin's crimes possible, gave way to greater regulation and oversight. But the case's impact reached beyond procedural changes. It forced a reckoning with the supernatural beliefs that permeated Irish society, particularly among the working classes. Folk magic and superstition had always existed alongside Catholicism in Ireland. Lucky charms, protective rituals, and belief in the supernatural power of certain objects were commonplace. The Galvin case demonstrated how these beliefs, when twisted by desperation or mental instability, could provide justification for horrific acts. Churches across Ireland began preaching against pagan superstitions, while scholars and journalists debated the role of folklore in a modernizing society. The case became a touchstone in arguments about education, poverty, and the psychological toll of economic uncertainty. Medical professionals, particularly those interested in the emerging field of psychiatry, studied Galvin's case extensively. His notebooks and confession provided rare documentation of how someone could maintain rational functioning in most areas of life, while harboring deeply irrational beliefs in others. The concept of compartmentalized delusion emerged partly from analysis of cases like Galvin's. The investigation itself became a model for future detective work. Inspector Crane's systematic approach, compiling missing persons data, analyzing patterns, following evidentiary threads, represented a new, more scientific approach to criminal investigation. His methods were studied at police training academies and influenced the development of criminal investigation techniques across the British Empire. Tragically, the case also revealed how many people had vanished without adequate investigation. The 7 additional missing persons cases Crane identified highlighted systemic failures in how authorities treated disappearances of people considered transient or socially marginal. Bookmakers, travelers, seasonal workers, all had been viewed as less worthy of investigative resources than settled, respectable citizens. This realization prompted reforms in how missing persons cases were handled. Registry systems improved. Cross-jurisdictional communication increased. The assumption that certain people just disappeared as part of their lifestyle began to be challenged. For the victims' families, the case brought a mixture of closure and deepened grief. Margaret O'Donnell attended every day of Galvin's trial, sitting in the gallery with a photograph of her husband pinned to her breast. After the verdict, she told reporters, "I know now what happened to Seamus, but I'll never understand why. What kind of man kills for luck? What kind of world creates such men?" Her question echoed through Irish society for years. The economic desperation of the land war era, the erosion of traditional community structures, the psychological impact of poverty and uncertainty. All these factors were scrutinized as potential contributors to Galvin's psychology. The case also left a lasting impact on Listowel itself. The town's reputation as a racing venue suffered significantly. Attendance at the 1889 races dropped by nearly 40%. It would take years for the town to rehabilitate its image and convince people that the races were safe. The river Feel Hollow, where Galvin had hidden his victims, became a site of dark pilgrimage. Despite efforts to fill it in, people continued to visit the location, some out of morbid curiosity, others seeking to understand what had happened there. Local folklore quickly grew around the site, with stories of haunting and curses that persist in some form even today. Perhaps most disturbingly, the case revealed that Galvin hadn't been unique. In the years following his trial, similar cases emerged across Europe. A bookmaker in London was found to be collecting hair from successful competitors as luck talismans. A gambling den operator in Paris had been stealing personal effects from wealthy patrons. The intersection of gambling, with its inherent randomness and human desire to control chance, and superstitious belief seemed to create a particularly toxic psychological environment. The Galvin case became a reference point for understanding this phenomenon. In 1892, the Irish Folklore Commission began a project documenting superstitious beliefs and their potential dangers, citing the Galvin case as a primary motivation. The resulting archive, still maintained today, provides invaluable insight into the folk beliefs of 19th century Ireland and how they persisted despite modernization. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about capital punishment. Galvin's execution was one of the last public hangings in Ireland, and the spectacle of his death, attended by crowds that included children, prompted questions about whether such public displays served justice or merely fed morbid fascination. By 1900, public executions would be abolished in Ireland, partly due to concerns raised by cases like Galvin's, where the condemned had become a figure of dark fascination rather than simple criminal justice. What drove Thomas Galvin to transform from a calculating bookmaker into a collector of death? Was it simply economic desperation twisted by superstition? Or was there something deeper, a fundamental inability to accept that chance governs all our lives, that luck cannot be controlled or captured no matter how many talismans we carry? Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you think superstitious beliefs can ever justify evil acts in a person's mind? Or was Galvin simply using folklore as an excuse for something darker he already carried within himself? If you found this lost chapter of Irish history as chilling as we did, subscribe to Fierce Sermon for more deep dives into the crimes and mysteries history has tried to forget. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. And remember, the objects we invest with meaning, the charms we carry for luck, the rituals we perform to feel control over an uncertain world, they say more about our psychology than they ever could about supernatural forces. The items recovered from Thomas Galvin's cache still reside in the Kerry County archives. They've been catalogued, preserved, studied. They're just objects now, metal and fabric and dried organic matter. Whatever power Galvin believed they contained died with him on that May morning in 1889. Or did it? See you in the next video.